Little James would not stop crying that morning. Samuel carried him inside the small hut, moving from one corner to another, whispering softly, trying to calm him. But the child kept stretching his tiny hands towards Stella as she quietly folded her clothes into a small travelling bag. When Samuel finally noticed the bag in her hand, his voice trembled. "Stella, where are you going?" Samuel said. Then she looked straight at him and said words that made the baby cry even louder. "Samuel, I am leaving. This marriage is over." Before she reached the doorway, Samuel dropped to his knees on the bare floor, still holding little James, begging her not to go, reminding her they had a child together. But Stella did not stop. She lifted her bag, stepped outside the hut, and walked out of the compound without turning back. She did not know that before that same day would end, something was already waiting for her on that road. Sit back as we unveil this shocking story. Samuel Okafor had never been the kind of man who made a noise about who he was. He did not boast. He did not argue loudly in the compound or parade himself at village meetings. He simply worked rising before the morning found its voice, tying his boots in the grey darkness, eating whatever was left from the night before if there was anything to eat, and walking the long road to wherever labour waited for him that day. He was not educated beyond secondary school. His father had died when Samuel was 17, leaving behind a mud hut, a small plot of farmland that the dry seasons had made difficult, and a family name that had never meant poverty, but had never meant comfort either. Samuel accepted this inheritance without bitterness. He told himself, and he genuinely believed, that a man who works honestly and loves his family has everything that truly matters. He had married Stella at 25. She was 22, the daughter of a retired school teacher from the next village, and she was the most beautiful thing Samuel had ever seen, not because of her face alone, though her face was lovely in the soft way of a woman who has not yet been hardened by life, but because of the way she laughed, full and open and unguarded. The kind of laugh that made everyone in the room want to know what was funny. He had courted her for 8 months before she agreed. He had walked to her father's compound on a Sunday and stated his intentions with the formal simplicity of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing elaborate to offer, only himself, his willingness to work, and his word. Her father had studied him for a long time before nodding. Her mother had said nothing but had pressed a kola nut into his hand as he left, which in that village was its own kind of blessing. They had built something small but real. The hut was not large, 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen space, a veranda where Samuel would sit in the evenings and watch the village settle into night. But it was theirs. It had the particular dignity of a thing built honestly, even if modestly, and in those first months they had been genuinely happy the way young people are happy before they understand how much the world asks of happiness. Then James arrived. Samuel had wept when he first held his son. He was not ashamed of it. He stood in the small room with the baby wrapped in a cloth that smelled of palm oil and warmth, and the tears came without his permission, and he did not wipe them away. He simply looked at this small, complete person who had come from nothing into everything and understood for the first time in his life what it meant to have something worth protecting absolutely. He named him James, after the apostle, steady, faithful, unflinching. a name that asked something of the person who carried it. Stella had held the baby with a different expression. Not cold, not without love, but more complicated. A mixture of wonder and worry and something else, something that looked like the beginning of a calculation. She was looking at their son and asking a question she would not put into words for a long time. Is this the life we are giving him? And is this enough? Samuel believed the family in his arms was his only wealth. Stella believed the family in her arms was the weight that kept her from finding hers. Stella had come into the marriage with more than love. She had come with expectations, not extravagant ones, but the quiet expectations of someone who believed her life would continue moving forward. That the village was a starting point, not a destination. That Samuel's work ethic would translate, over time, into something more tangible than daily survival. When James was born and the expenses doubled and the roof needed patching and Samuel's earnings from farm labour and market lifting barely covered the week's food, Stella began to feel what she could only describe as a closing, the sense of a door shutting, the sense that the future she had imagined was being replaced by 4 walls and a crying baby and the same scarcity tomorrow that had been there yesterday. She did not say this immediately. She tried for months to hold her disappointment privately and push it down and focus on what was in front of her. She cooked. She nursed James through every illness that visited in that first year. She swept the compound. She greeted neighbours with a smile that cost her more than they knew. But inside, quietly, something was shifting. A woman can carry discontent in silence for only so long before it finds somewhere to go. It began with small complaints, quiet ones. The kind that a patient husband could absorb, address gently, and move past. Food was expensive. James needed new clothes. The rains had delayed the market. Samuel listened to all of these and responded the way he knew how, by working harder, by going to bed later, by eating less himself so there would be enough for Stella and the boy. But hardship is patient too. It does not resolve simply because a good man refuses to give up. By the time James was 8 months old, there were weeks when Samuel returned home with barely enough to buy the ingredients for one proper meal. He supplemented the farm labour with market lifting work, carrying heavy loads from traders' trucks to market stalls, work that left his back aching and his hands roughened, work that men with options avoided. Samuel had no options, so he did not avoid it. He counted coins at the end of each day with the careful arithmetic of someone who cannot afford a mistake. Stella watched all of this. And something in the watching began to do its quiet damage. Not because Samuel was failing, he was not failing, he was fighting, but because the ceiling of what he could provide was visible to her now. She could see exactly how far his effort reached, and she could see the distance between that reach and what she had imagined their life would be. It was around this time that Stella's childhood friend Ngozi, who had moved to the city 3 years earlier, began calling more frequently. Ngozi had done well in the city, or at least she said she had. Her voice on the phone was different from the village girl Stella remembered. Polished, quick, full of references to things Stella had never experienced. She described her apartment, her neighbourhood, the restaurant where she sometimes ate on weekdays, the clothes in her wardrobe. Each call left Stella sitting longer than necessary by the roadside where the network was strongest, staring at the phone after the call ended, thinking about the distance between Ngozi's life and her own. The neighbours began to notice, not the phone calls themselves, but their effect, Stella's quieter manner, her longer absences from the compound in the afternoons, the way she sometimes stood at the edge of the road and looked in the direction of the city with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite resignation, but something uncomfortably between the two. Old women in the compound, notice first, as old women always do. One of them, Mama Nyele, said to another, "That one's eyes have started going somewhere. When a woman's eyes go before her feet, the feet will soon follow." Samuel had heard rumours, a neighbour's offhand comment, a pause in conversation that lasted too long, but he had chosen not to believe them. He trusted Stella. That trust was not naivety. It was a decision, a daily renewal of faith in the woman he had chosen. Then, one evening, he came home an hour earlier than expected and found Stella standing near the back of the compound, one hand pressed to her ear, smiling in a way he had not seen in months. The smile was not for him. It was for the voice in the phone. And it was the smile he had fallen in love with, full and open and unguarded. He stood still for a moment, watching. Then he quietly went inside and began preparing the evening fire. That night, Stella barely spoke at dinner. She ate quickly, fed James, and turned to face the wall before he had finished. Samuel lay beside her in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt for the first time the specific cold of a shared bed growing lonely. Days passed. A week, then another. The distance between them expanded without either of them formally declaring it. Stella stopped asking how his day had gone. Samuel stopped trying to fill the silence with stories from the market. James, too young to understand language but old enough to feel atmosphere, became fussier, as if the tension in the air had entered him somehow, and he was crying it out on everyone's behalf. Then Stella stopped cooking. Not dramatically, not with a pronouncement. She simply didn't. One evening there was no fire in the kitchen. Samuel cooked for James and himself without comment. Then 2 evenings, then a week of evenings. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand an explanation. He cooked and fed his son and set aside a portion for Stella and went to sleep wondering what he had missed. She stopped attending Sunday service. She who had sung in the choir in their first year of marriage, who had known the hymns by heart, who had walked beside him down the church road with James on her back, she stayed home, staring out through the small window at the Sunday morning compound, as if the life outside it belonged to someone else. The silence between them grew louder than any argument could have been. The person Stella spoke with most was not Ngozi alone. There was another voice, a man whose name she did not mention to anyone in the village. He had been introduced through Ngozi's network, a businessman, someone who knew people, someone who could help a young woman find work in the city if she was serious about starting over. The conversations had shifted slowly over the weeks. They had become less practical and more personal. He had begun saying things that had nothing to do with job opportunities and everything to do with how she felt and what she deserved and who she might become if she left behind the things that were holding her down. A man who tells a woman she deserves better is either the person who will prove it or the person who will use the idea of it to move her where he wants her to go. Stella did not stop to ask which kind of man this was. She was too hungry for the words themselves. In the village, no one was telling her she deserved better, Samuel was not a man of speeches. He expressed his love through presence, through labour, through returning every day and staying. But presence does not speak, and labour does not compliment, and staying when you are a woman looking toward the horizon can feel, on the hardest days, exactly like being held in place. The city voice said, "You are too young to suffer like this." Samuel showed up every day and said nothing at all. In the grammar of a woman at the edge of her endurance, the voice won. Mama Ngele came to Stella directly one afternoon while Samuel was away at the market. She sat across from her on the low stool without pretense and said plainly, "I know what you are thinking. I can see it on you the way I can see rain coming before it falls. I am asking you, as a woman who has lived your same thoughts 40 years ago, do not do this." Stella had listened with the careful politeness of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting for the speaker to finish. "Mama." Ngele saw this in her eyes and sighed. "What looks bright from far can be darkness when you reach it," she said. "And the darkness at home, the kind you know is easier to walk in than the darkness in a strange place." Stella thanked her for her concern. Mama Nyele walked away, knowing her words had landed somewhere, but not knowing if the soil would hold them. What Stella did not know, what no one knew except Samuel and the motorcycle owner, Musa, who lived near the church, was that Samuel had been making a plan. 3 weeks before the morning Stella packed her bag, he had gone to Musa in the early morning and asked to learn transport work. Not because he wanted to leave farm labour, but because he had calculated that motorcycle transport could earn 3 times what he made per day carrying market loads. Musa had agreed to teach him. Samuel was to begin riding practice on the following Saturday. He had told no one because he wanted to come home one day with real changed income and lay it before Stella without announcement. He wanted the change to speak before he did. He had been carrying this plan the way he carried everything quietly, with conviction, with the patience of a man who believes that work eventually produces its own evidence. He never got the chance to show her. She left before Saturday came. He was building a ladder in secret. She had already decided the house had no ceiling worth reaching for. The morning before the morning she left, Samuel had stayed awake very late. Not because of any argument, there had been no argument that night. The absence of argument was its own kind of signal, the silence of a decision already made. He had sat on the veranda in the dark, listening to the compound breathe around him, listening to James sleep through the thin wall, thinking about what more he could do and whether more was the right question. He had prayed, not loudly, not formally, but in the way a man prays when he is alone at night and afraid of what morning might bring. A conversation with God that was more desperate than devout. Then he had gone inside and lain down beside his wife and told himself, "Tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow I will say something. Tomorrow we will talk." Tomorrow she packed her bag while he was still sleeping. Stella walked fast at first, the way people walk when they are afraid that slowing down will let second thoughts catch up. Her bag was not heavy, she had packed only what was essential, which told its own story about how final the decision felt to her. She did not take the framed photograph from the bedroom shelf. She did not take the small Bible Samuel had given her when James was born. She took clothes, money she had been setting aside in small amounts for weeks, and the phone that connected her to the voice that had promised a different life. She walked through the compound gate and turned left toward the main road without looking back. If she had looked back, she would have seen the doorway of the hut, and if she had seen the doorway, she might have seen Samuel appear there moments later, still holding James, his face carrying something she had stopped, allowing herself to look at directly the face of a man who loves you and cannot understand why that love is not enough. She did not look back. This took more effort than she expected. The road to the junction was 40 minutes of red dust and morning sun and the ordinary sounds of village life beginning its day, a woman calling to chickens, the distant sound of a radio, a motorcycle passing with the urgency of someone who is always late. Stella walked through all of it with her eyes fixed forward and her jaw set and her heart performing the complicated act of feeling both grief and relief simultaneously. At the junction, she boarded a bus headed for the city. She took a window seat and watched the village recede and then disappear and then become a memory inside the moving frame of the bus window. She called the city voice. It rang. He did not answer. She told herself he was busy. She stared out the window at the road unspooling ahead of her and told herself that people are busy and the call would be returned shortly and everything would unfold as it had been promised. The city was everything the village was. Not. Loud, crowded, indifferent, full of people moving with the concentrated purpose of those who have somewhere to be and no interest in anyone who does not share their destination. Stella arrived at the motor park with her bag and her phone and the address Ngozi had once mentioned. She called the city voice again. Straight to voicemail, she called Ngozi. Ngozi answered, surprised. "Stella, you are here? Now? Without telling me?" Her voice was warm but strained in the way of someone calculating space and time and inconvenience. "I am at work. I cannot leave. Can you find somewhere to wait?" Stella sat on a bench near the motor park entrance. She called the city voice a third time. Nothing. A fourth. Nothing. She sent a message, "I am here, as we planned." The message delivered. It was not read. An hour passed, then 2. The sun began its afternoon intensity. Stella counted the money in her purse, the money that had seemed significant in the village economy and seemed considerably less significant here in a city where everything costs twice what logic suggests. She had enough for perhaps one night in a budget guest house. Perhaps. It was in this second hour of sitting that Stella felt the first real crack in the resolution that had carried her out of the hut that morning. It was not a catastrophic feeling. It was worse than that it was a quiet one. The quiet of someone who has made a very large decision and is sitting in the first moments of understanding what the decision actually means. The city voice had promised to receive her. He had been specific, she recalled, or had he been specific? She reread their messages, scrolling back through weeks of conversation. She found the passages she had remembered as promises and read them again with clearer eyes and found that they were not quite promises. They were suggestions. They were the language of someone offering possibility without commitment. You could start again here. There is opportunity for someone like you. I would be happy to help if you decide to come. If she had erased that word from her memory. She had needed to erase it because without it the sentences were too thin to hold her weight. She had read promises in a man's words, the same way a thirsty person reads water in a mirage. The wanting made the reading, and the reading made the believing, and the believing moved her feet to a place the reality was not waiting. By late afternoon, Ngozi had come to the motor park, tired from a full day of work. She listened to the story and then said quietly, "The man, what exactly did he promise you?" Stella began to answer and heard in her own words the architecture of what she had built in her head, and heard how little of it rested on anything solid. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Ngozi said nothing for a long moment. Then, gently, "Stella, he was talking to you, but he has a wife. I know this man. I should have said something. I thought it was just conversation." The city in that moment became very small. The night Stella spent in Ngozi's small room was the longest night of her adult life. She lay on a thin mat on the floor and stared at the ceiling of a city apartment and thought about the ceiling of the hut she had walked out of that morning. The hut ceiling had a crack in the corner that Samuel had been meaning to repair for months. She had looked at that crack so many times in their years together, had lain beneath it during illness, during late-night nursing of James, during the quiet insomnia of worry that she knew its shape the way she knew her own hands. She had looked at it with frustration, as evidence of all the things that were not yet fixed. She had never once looked at it with any form of tenderness. She looked at it now, in her memory, from the floor of a stranger's room in a city that had not been waiting for her, and she felt something break open in her chest in a way that crying cannot fully address, but that her body tried to address with crying anyway. She wept quietly, facing the wall, listening to Ngozi's slow breathing across the room, holding herself with both arms. She thought about Samuel on his knees, on the bare floor of the hut. She had walked past him. She had looked at him kneeling there with James in his arms, and she had kept walking, telling herself his tears were manipulation, his begging was weakness, his love was a trap dressed as devotion. She had needed to believe these things to keep her feet moving. Lying on Ngozi's floor, she tried to reconstruct that story and found that it kept collapsing. Samuel had never raised his hand to her. Samuel had never raised his voice beyond what gentle frustration produced. Samuel had worked every single day of their marriage without complaint, without self-pity, without demanding recognition for the labour that kept them fed. Samuel had held James through every fever night, had walked to the chemist at midnight when the child could not breathe properly, had sat in the hospital waiting area for 6 hours with a patience that the nurses had commented on. Samuel had loved her in the way of a man who does not know how to love any other way, completely, quietly, without strategies. Was that enough? Was it what she had imagined? No. Was it nothing? She lay in the dark and understood with the terrible clarity that comes only when the comfort of self-deception is removed that it was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. Meanwhile, back in the village, Samuel had not done what she might have expected a wounded man to do. He had not gone to his family to report what she had done. He had not called her parents to announce her abandonment. He had not gone to neighbours to seek sympathy or begin the work of building a case against her. He had fed James a dinner of rice and egg, had bathed him with the careful attention of a man doing something for the first time and determined to do it correctly, had sung to him the song Stella always sang at bedtime, a song about the moon watching over sleeping children, had waited until James surrendered to sleep, and then had sat on the veranda in the gathering dark. He sat there through the evening, He sat there as the compound lights came on one by one, and the night insects began their chorus, and the moon moved across its arc. He sat there with James asleep against his chest, one hand resting on the boy's back, rising and falling with his breathing. Mama Nyele passed by the compound gate at around 8 o'clock and saw him sitting there. She had expected to find him broken or angry or drunk on palm wine, as some men in his situation became. Instead, she found him sitting, watchful, patient. "She may not come back tonight," Mama Nyele said carefully. "I know," Samuel said. "Then why are you sitting outside?" He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "Because if she comes back, I want her to see that I am here." Mama Nyele looked at him for a long time. Then she went home without saying another word, which in her vocabulary was the highest possible expression of respect. He did not wait for her because he was weak. He waited because he understood something she had forgotten, that the person who stays is stronger than the person who runs. In the city, Stella was awake at 3 in the morning, looking at her phone. She had 12 missed calls, all from different numbers she did not recognize, which turned out to be neighbors relaying messages from Samuel, who did not have a phone of his own and had been borrowing from person to person across the evening, trying to reach her. The messages were brief and all the same in their essential content. "James is fine. I am here. Please call when you can. Not, how could you? Not, you have shamed me. Not, what will people say? Only, James is fine. I am here." She sat with the phone in her hands and those messages on the screen, and she felt the distance between where she was and where she had come from, not as freedom, but as a wound, raw, specific, located exactly in the centre of her chest. At 4 in the morning, she woke Ngozi and said quietly, "I need to go home." Ngozi, who had been half awake and waiting for this, sat up immediately and began helping her pack. The first bus back toward the village left at 5:30. Stella was on it. She sat in the same kind of window seat she had taken the morning before, watching the city recede as the village had receded, the tall buildings giving way to smaller structures, the tarmac giving way to red road, the crowded anonymity giving way to the familiar scale of a place where everyone knows everyone else's business. She arrived at the village junction as the morning was just beginning to consider itself properly started. The air was the particular fresh of early village mornings, dew, damp and wood smoke, and something green from the surrounding farmland that the city has no equivalent of, and that she had stopped noticing years ago and noticed now with a sharpness that was almost painful. She walked from the junction toward the compound, the same red dust road, the same 40 minutes in reverse. But the walking felt entirely different from the walking of the day before, slower, heavier, in a different way. The weight now internal, the weight of a reckoning she was carrying toward a door she was not sure would open. She thought, as she walked, about everything she had not seen, or had not permitted herself to see. She thought about Samuel's hands, how rough they had become in the years of labour, how she had once held those hands with a love that was uncomplicated, and how somewhere along the way she had begun looking at them differently, as evidence of a life not going anywhere, rather than as evidence of a man fighting for everything. She thought about what she had mistaken love for, and what she had mistaken sufficiency for, and how the two mistakes together had brought her to a city floor in the middle of the night, with nothing waiting for her on the other side of her escape. She was not angry at Samuel anymore. She was not sure she had truly been angry at him to begin with. She had been angry at her situation, which was a different thing, and she had displaced that anger onto the nearest available target, the man who showed up every day and stayed. It is one of the cruelest ironies of human disappointment that we most reliably punish the people who do not leave. The compound came into view. She slowed without meaning to. Her feet, which had moved with such determined speed away from this place less than 24 hours ago, now moved with the tentative care of someone approaching something fragile. The veranda was visible from the gate, and on the veranda, as Mamangele had seen him, and as she had somehow, in the deepest, most stubborn place of her knowing believed he would still be, was Samuel. He had fallen asleep in the chair. James was in his lap, also asleep, his small body curved against his father's chest, with the perfect surrender of a child who knows he is held by someone who will not drop him. Samuel's head was tilted back against the wall. He looked, in sleep, younger than he did awake. The lines of effort and worry that daylight carved into his face were relaxed, and what remained was the man she had married at 22. Stella stood at the gate for a long moment, looking at them. Then she walked into the compound and sat down on the step below the veranda and set her bag at her feet and covered her face with both hands and wept the way a person weeps when there is no one to perform for. Deeply, completely, without restraint, the kind of weeping that empties something that has been full for too long. The sound woke Samuel. She heard him stir, heard the careful movement of a man trying not to disturb the sleeping child in his lap, heard the pause that meant he was seeing her, processing that she was real and not a dream. Then silence. Neither of them spoke. James slept on. After a long time, Samuel shifted James gently to the crook of one arm and stood from the chair and came to the edge of the veranda and sat on the step beside her. Not across from her. Beside her, so close their shoulders touched, the way they had sat in the early months of their marriage, when they were still discovering the particular comfort of being in the same physical space as the person you love. He did not ask where she had been. He did not ask who she had spoken to, or what she had been promised, or why she had left, or whether she was sorry. He simply sat beside her and placed James, still sleeping, across both their laps, the weight of him distributed equally between his mother and his father, bridging the space that had grown between them with the uncomplicated physicality of a child who does not know about distance and does not care. They talked, eventually. Not that morning. That morning belonged to the silence of two people beginning to breathe in the same rhythm again. But in the days that followed, carefully, haltingly, they talked. Stella told Samuel about the city, not the version that preserved her pride, but the real version, the bench at the motor park, the unanswered calls, Ngozi's floor, the middle of the night, understanding that the promises had been constructed from her own desperation rather than another person's sincerity. She told him because she had decided that she owed him the truth, at least as much as she owed him an apology. Samuel told her about Musa and the motorcycle. He told her about the Saturday practice session that had never happened because she had left on the Friday morning before it. He watched her face as she received this information, watched the particular expression of a person who has made a decision based on incomplete information and is now receiving the missing piece. Stella was quiet for a long time. After he told her this, then she said, "Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to show you," he said. "Not tell you. I wanted to come home with something different and let you see it. I left before you could show me." "Yes." Another long silence. Then, "Samuel, I am sorry." He looked at her. "I know," he said. And then, after a moment, he said the thing that mattered most. "I know that I have not been enough, not because I haven't tried, but I know the gap has been real. I am not angry that you felt it. I am only asking that next time come to me before you go to someone else. Come to me with the gap. We can look at it together." Stella looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. It was not a small nod. It was the nod of someone making a commitment. The most important conversation in any marriage is the one that almost never happens, the honest one, spoken before desperation takes the place of words. Samuel began transport work the following Saturday. Within 3 weeks, his daily income had nearly tripled. It was not wealth. It was not the city life that Stella had imagined. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was growing. Stella began attending Sunday service again. The choir received her back with the quiet dignity of women who understand that lives are not straight lines and that a woman returning to a community she left is not weaker. For having left, she is different. James, who was walking now on unsteady but determined legs, moved through the compound with the confidence of a child who has never doubted he was wanted. He did not know what the household had passed through. He only knew the household as it was now his father's voice in the morning, his mother's hands in the evening, the particular warmth of being between two people who have decided, deliberately, to choose each other. The crack in the ceiling of the hut Samuel repaired it on the second Saturday after Stella came home. He mixed the cement himself and filled it carefully and smoothed it flat and stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who has fixed a thing that needed fixing. Stella watched him from the doorway. "It took you long enough," she said. He looked at her over his shoulder and said, "Some things take time." She understood that he was not talking about the ceiling. The village watched this story unfold the way villages always watch stories closely, with memory and with the particular interest of people who understand that other people's lives are not entertainment but instruction. The women who had warned Stella did not say they had told her so. That is not what warnings are for. Mamangele simply nodded when she saw Stella at the borehole one morning, and Stella nodded back, and in that exchange was a conversation that required no words. The story of Stella's departure and return did not become gossip. It became something rarer. It became a reference point. When women spoke of patience, they mentioned Samuel. When they spoke of the danger of bright promises, they mentioned the city voice who had stopped answering calls. When they spoke of the courage it takes to return to a thing you have walked away from, they mentioned Stella not with judgment, but with the complicated respect that communities offer to people who have made mistakes and then made the harder choice, because walking away is easy. The road that leads away from difficulty is always open, and it is always willing to receive you. What is hard is the road back. What requires courage is not departure, but return the ability to walk back through the gate you left in anger and sit down on the step below the person you hurt and allow what is true to be true and what is broken to be repaired and what is small to be enough for now. Because enough for now, tended carefully, becomes more than enough with time. Stella learned this not from a sermon and not from a wise woman's warning, but from a motor park bench in an indifferent city, and from a man asleep on a veranda with her son on his chest, and from the road home in the early morning light of a day she would remember for the rest of her life and years. Later, when James was old enough to ask his mother about the photograph she kept, the one taken on a Sunday morning, the three of them on the veranda, Samuel's arm around her shoulder, James held between them like something precious, she would tell him only this: sometimes the life we are running away from is the very life fighting to protect us. And the people who stay when you go are worth coming back to. James would nod in the way children nod when they are being told something important they do not yet fully understand. But the words would settle in him somewhere, finding the place where true things go deep and quiet and ready, waiting for the day they would be needed. Patience builds homes, but impatience destroys them. Sometimes the life we are running away from is the very life fighting to protect us. The person who walks away tests the road. The person who stays tests the heart. And it is the heart, in the end, that outlasts the road. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification, because we bring to you real-life stories that will inspire you. God bless you and see you in the next video. Please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.